Hi, and welcome back to Aimless Ramblings. This is number 20, after a bit of a hiatus. But today we're just going to discuss, in a broad sense, sentencing. But first up, it's me. So that's rare. I don't get to hand off to anybody. So anyway, in relation to sentencing, because I brought this up, what actually sparked this whole entire discussion and why I thought of it was there was this discussion of two individuals who were both done for this crime and both acquitted for both the same crime, except one took a plea bargain. And because he took the plea bargain and is considered criminal, he has no chance to have a job because he's been criminally labeled as somebody who's been in jail for a criminal offense and as such cannot hold a job down because nobody wants to hire an ex-con. So this brings up this whole entire thing. I will be discussing how there's the sentencing and how it's not taking the whole entire element of sentencing into consideration. So the source of a lot of these issues that we will probably discuss throughout comes from this whole entire idea that as a society, a lot of us actually want retributive justice. So if something goes wrong, if somebody robs a house, we want to make sure that we get our pound of flesh so that we can make sure that they are punished and as such that society's wrongs are righted. However, through several different implementations, a lot of how the corrections sort of goes along the idea of restorative justice and where they want to try and make somebody be able to return to society post-thing. So I'm going to throw to you guys. What is your opinion? Do you think that the justice system should be, made to be the judge, jury and executioner? Tim?
Well, I would say in some ways, and I think we'll end up talking about it a bit in terms of both Sam's and my particular specific examples, but in some ways, a big part of this has to do with kind of whether you're looking at it from from an ethical perspective, utilitarian or a deontological sort of perspective. So from a utilitarian perspective, a lot of people talk about potentially treating criminality or certain specific criminal acts as like a public health issue rather than treating it as in a more traditional criminological or law and order sort of styles, which can result in higher levels of incarceration but not necessarily lower levels of recidivism. And part of that comes to the idea of, if we completely emotionally detach ourselves, blah, 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 the rational mind, etc., that we would be able to solve the problem of criminology and crime by simply making people not want to commit crime anymore. And I think in some ways this is a bit of a utopian fantasy, although there is definitely arguments to be made in terms of you don't necessarily want to penalize for the sake of penalization. Although from a deontological perspective, in terms of a rule breaking results in a rule punishment sort of perspective, definitely there is I think there's almost an emotional reaction from most humans, and because we are emotional beings, there is that desire for us, as you said, to get our pound of flesh. And it's not just as simple as for a society, because people think of a criminal action. It's not just a crime against the state. Law also provides, historically at least, a mechanism for preventing violent cycles of escalation between family groups, with retributive justice. So if there isn't a sense of, or a feeling of retribution, at an individual and familial level, people, I think, maybe don't necessarily would buy into that legal system. Simon, what do you have to say?
Yeah, you definitely raised several really interesting ideas. So specifically about how it's about this emotional versus and the pound of flesh element and then also how it's sort of being used in the past to sort of keep that balance. The only one that I had a bit of an issue with was when you brought up the high idea that in an ideal world we won't have any crime. But the issue is that crime is what teaches the borders of society, and so therefore when you get rid of all criminals, that just creates a new border, and then there's new criminal class, pretty much. Because crime in and of itself isn't, some blight that we can remove from society because, robbing a house was considered criminal we all agree that's pretty criminal. But so was, people of African American descent sitting on buses amongst, people who were not from African American descent. And that whole entire apartheid was a legal action, and everybody that fought against it was technically committing criminal acts. And this is where the issue lies with, how society wants its pound of flesh. However, where I'm trying to get to, but I've sort of had to do all this background to bring it forward, is this discussion on how sentencing isn't holistic. So we go, okay, cool, well, we got our pound of flesh, so they're going to go for 10 years, but they don't consider the conditions that they'll be kept in. I think there's a Swedish argument. But anyway, Sam, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just pulling into the concept you brought up before of if you have no crime, you'll change what the definition of crime is. And I can totally see the logical end point of that. But I wonder as well if there are maybe more, I'm going to call them natural laws, for lack of a better term. I can't remember who I'm stealing that from. But, there are certain intrinsic things that violating those are the actual laws or actual crimes, for lack of a better, taking someone's thing, rather than the more complex societal constructs that we dictate as laws. Just a thought. What do you reckon?
Tim, you have a reaction to that?
Well, I would argue that in terms of the legal tradition, there is a very long, particularly in the Western context, tradition of natural law, which you see throughout natural theology and the entire scholastic movement and legal movements throughout medieval Europe, which as people tried to naturalize the legal tradition and try and make rational those legal traditions, they initially sought obviously drawing upon a divinity, but then also drawing upon sort of divine ideas in terms of law. But I think in some ways that you end up, when you start talking about natural law, you have some interesting sort of perspectives where certain things don't necessarily align. So, for instance, property law is a pretty good example you're bringing up there in terms of taking people's stuff. But when you talk about certain power or financial imbalances in a certain society leading to revolutionary results, the arguments that people could make is that there is a violation of the natural law by those people accumulating so much wealth for themselves at the detriment of others in the society, or not sharing their wealth when they have the opportunity to. Similarly, depending on what you want to talk about in terms of natural law, the sanctity of life, which is a massive argument when you start talking about natural law, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's this serious issue of when is said life sacred, when is it not sacred, which the outcome of that is obviously the pro-life and pro-choice debate that we're seeing still occurring in America and Australia, although obviously pro-choice seems to have made pretty strong headwinds over here. It's suffered some recent sort of retrenchment back in the States. So, yeah. Sam, you had to say?
Just to touch on, I think that only ever becomes an issue because people, so in regards to pro-life, it's pro some lives, not others. If we all as a society got together and said, right, we'll kill no humans in any way, shape or form, that would mean arguably there are no more armies. You understand? So we would be in a society that was so drastically different from our current one. We may be in a situation where the need to access abortion doesn't actually even exist anymore because the standard of education and well-being is so high that there would be no unplanned pregnancies. So maybe, it doesn't always boil down to, well, that doesn't work out. Because, as you said earlier, it is an ultimately utopian concept. So, yeah.
Oh, you utopian socialist, pre-Marx you. Simon?
Definitely we've highlighted several things about natural law. And yeah, I just was wondering how you think that would apply to the holistic sentencing as such. A Swedish argument argued that if you followed the letter of the law, the thing of putting somebody in prison, the whole punishment is supposed to be that they're removed from society for X amount of period of time. So a lot of Swedish prisons are, fairly nice things, but the punishment is being removed. Whereas if you ask an American public system, they usually go, well, bare minimum requirement is what you need to give them, because that's all part of them being a criminal. So how do you guys feel in relation to natural law? Whoever wants to go first?
Yeah. So I fall very heavily on the side of reformation rather than retribution in terms of what the legal system should be doing. And I do think that confinement provides an opportunity for that reformation that may not be existing in the environment, say, currently. So, for instance, there may be a substance addict who commits crimes because of that. Or, there could be a person who is violent because they have an undiagnosed or untreated mental illness. This separation from society and whatever environment they're currently in is it's a possibility, in my mind at least, to break that cycle and stop which I'll talk about later, the reoffending. So I think, in terms of natural law, just a strict black-white, this is your punishment, we're just going to lock you up, is a waste of everyone's time, and we should probably be focusing more on attempting to reform, but that's just mine. What are your 2 cents, Tim?
Oh, yeah. So I suppose to take the contrarian position, not because I'm necessarily supporting it, but something I'd like to throw to Simon after we're finished is that in some ways the argument is that the confinement from society is not necessarily about reforming said individual, it's also about deterring other individuals. And I know that one of probably the earliest arguments for detention over execution was actually by Julius Caesar in the Catiline conspiracy, where he suggested that it would be better to confine the conspirators rather than to execute them for lengthy periods, because this would be worse than a death penalty. And as such, it would be a sort of a deterrent to others. And I suppose that leads to the point of, well, you've sort of brought it up in your the comment you made previously, where in terms of if you are aiming for a utopian mean, something like maybe what Plato's First Society and the Republic, there, that utopian socialist, everybody, there is no reason to commit crime, so why would you commit crime? I think, though, the issue is that, as Simon has said, not everyone necessarily acts along those lines, and in some ways, for some people, it's about finding those edges, the hard edges, and the blurry lines as to what is societally acceptable and what is not societally acceptable in a social context. But I think that you did have something to say, Sam, specifically about criminology and sentencing.
Yeah. So I was, having a troll through the reoffending data just before for Australia. And it's actually quite sad almost. So people coming into the system, so those who have offended in the year 2008 to 2009, that financial year, 74% of them had one or more police proceeding already against them. 15% had 2. 5.6 had 3, and 2.7 had 4. 3.5% had 5 or more. You go to somewhere like, say, that's the national average, like Tasmania, 8% have 5 or more proceedings against them. So, this is nearly 1 in 10 people every year that are getting arrested have been arrested or charged with offences 10 times before in their lives. If you have a look at a 2-year window around people's release, say we pick New South Wales, 54% of them are back dealing with corrective services within a 2-year window of their release. So this, broadly speaking, I guess the point I'm coming to is, one, we are knowingly and willingly releasing people that will re-offend into the communities. And if you have a look at the trending, it tends to be for instance, sexual assault and related offences. The most likely offence they will re-offend with is sexual assault and related offences. Burglary, assault. For almost all, the re-offending crime is the same initial crime. So all we're doing is, we'll say take an assault. You take someone out of the system for 4 years, you lock them in a box, and then in 4 years' time you let them back out, and then within a 2-year window there's a 50% chance they're going to do the exact same crime again. And overall, there's probably, I don't know, like a 70% chance that they're going to commit the same crime again. Simon, what's your thoughts?
So in relation to Sam's discussion, how he was talking about recidivism and how it's usually the same crime, and the idea that they are locked away in a box, and then once they return from that box, they're committing the same crime, is sort of ignoring the fact that in a lot of cases, what happens is they actually, inverted commas, upskill. So usually when you get done for something along, let's say the idea of sexual assault, you're usually locked up with people who have a similar kind of background in relation to, they probably also have committed sexual assault. So you sort of are all chucked in the same thing and socialize within that same idea, and you come out with similar skills. It's also the same idea as I was mentioning before about the loss in prospects. So specifically when it comes to like theft and whatnot, you're having a combination of getting upskilled from being put in the prison system, which is adolescent offending is the perfect example of this, which is a whole entire different discussion I could talk to for hours. But then also there's the other element that there's very little alternative streams to follow down, because it's very hard to get into the sort of workplace when you already got a little seal and signed, sealed, and delivered stuck on you that you were previously incarcerated. Sam, you have a rebuttal?
Not a rebuttal, no. I picked this topic in part because I thought the synergy between the two was quite strong. Les Mis, prisoner 24601, he serves his time for his petty crime, but then he's driven back to crime because he cannot work, he cannot feed himself, right? And, so Queensland, where I'm from, at the moment, has like probably around a 15% unemployment rate. There's about, I think they said that about 12 to 18 people going for every vacant job at the moment. So if you have that, that black mark on your on your list of a conviction, you're not going to be getting employment. So how do we? So I guess the central question I had from looking at this data was these data actually. Sorry. We have two issues I see. One is we're letting back out people who will almost certainly reoffend. The likelihood of them reoffending is greater than not. And on the other hand, we are preventing them from having the ability to not reoffend. I know we're not going to be solving the world, and these are not concepts that are new to anyone, but what on earth do we do? Simon?
Well, to deal with this issue, you've got to... So pretty much, if you accept the instance they go into the system as a criminal, you've pretty much labeled them as criminal, and once they get removed from it, so you've got 2 points of entry where you can try and make a change. So that's either prior to them being put into the criminal justice system, or after they get out, how do you transition back into society? And there's a lot of stuff that's been defunded because obviously it's very expensive for very few people to try and do these transitions. So I'll try and cover both of them. So in relation to them going into the system, the best way to try and avoid... So let's not say like all the sexual offense people should be like get slapped in the wrist or whatnot, but if you could take an alternate path for, say, somebody's like a 12-year-old and they've broken into somebody's house. Well, okay, let's say they've turned 20 and they've stolen a car and they've gone through the process and this is the first offense, and you've realized that the reasoning behind it is a bit more complex. Restorative justice is sort of a method that I've got hold near and dear. So obviously I'll always, be preaching, that, you should put them through restorative justice. But that sort of just means it's a bit more humanized. However, when it comes to leaving, I feel like the easiest way to try and make it so they, when they go into the job market, they've got the black mark name and they don't get a job. What you do is you make a market which relies heavily on people who are ex-cons. And as such, that is the system that they can follow. So they've got at least a baseline system to be working from and getting the skills and the experience and the references to show that they can exist in society. So can't remember which, that there was like a small town that had a massive prison in it, and the issue was that they had this massive issue with staffing the prison. So prison guards, obviously you can't just get ex-prisoners, but for example, for catering, for a lot of that kind of stuff, what they were doing was, as this person would leave, they'd see people that they'd met day in, day out who were doing the catering, the yada, 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 who needed these kinds of jobs, and would go, okay, cool, well, if you can assist and we will pay you to work for us in supplying the system, you will be able to get job skills and such and such. And then the prison system itself is able to retool itself, because it's like, okay, cool, we've got several different opportunities to have people who can almost have a transition. So it's like this almost developing the transition from prison life into society, rather than just having a hard break, which is what happens a lot of times. It's like, yep, you've served your sentence, here's your stuff, get the hell out of here. Those are the two I can think of, but obviously Tim has some other ideas.
Well, I was going to say that obviously, as a criminologist, Simon, you probably have a bit of an advantage in terms of that side of the house. But I think it was actually a good transition point, because one of the issues Sam was talking about here was the release of people that we, or at least statistically speaking, are going to be known reoffenders back into the general society. And I understand that when you're talking about maybe people conducting shoplifting or, certain minor or misdemeanor offences or less serious or non-violent offences, that this is not necessarily as much of an issue. But the topic that I wanted to talk about is an issue which has not really been a significant one in Australia for 50-something years now, which is the issue of the death penalty. And hear me out so I'll make first of all a utilitarian argument, and then I'll throw it to you guys, and then I've got a few other little arguments in terms of polling and that kind of stuff. So the first argument from a utilitarian argument is that if you could know with statistical near perfection that an individual was going to reoffend for an extremely, for instance, let's say violent rapists or mass murderers or serial killers, or for instance, the guy over in Christchurch that shot up a mosque. Like for individuals like that, where either to keep them in prison for life, or the risk of them reoffending and being reinjected back into society once they've served out a life sentence is so high, then from a utilitarian argument, do you think it's justifiable that this individual could be put through a death penalty as the cost to society would be much less? Noting that I think they were saying it's going to cost the New Zealand taxpayer something like $4,000 a day to keep the Christchurch shooter in jail, as opposed to the average of about $400 a day for a normal high security prisoner. So I will throw firstly to Sam, and then Simon, if you've got something to say after that, I'll let it go to you.
So obviously I've don't support the death penalty, so I'll get that out of the way first. But big issues is one, whenever will that surety or the surety ever exist? I don't think we'll ever live in a framework in which we are confident enough that we are correct, that ending someone's life is probably the best way. It also means that you don't think they're salvageable. And does that mean at what point in their life did they stop becoming salvageable? Was it when, what is it? I'm your creepy Uncle Ernie. Was it when creepy Uncle Ernie fiddled around? Is that what broke this child? So from that action onwards, well, we may as well just kill the 4-year-old boy or the 5-year-old child. It's not their fault, but they're irreparably damaged. Or is it only, So that's, I guess, my issue is, at what point do you say this person is unsalvageable? Thoughts?
As with me, I always am going to first throw in something that's complete side tangent and then actually get to my argument. Sam, your discussion is a perfect mirror of there's an anime that's a philosophical concept, which is Psychopaths, where it pretty much just measures people's criminal intent. And as such, once you reach a particular level of criminal intent, they deem you as a criminal thing, and you can use lethal force to kill them, so outright. So as you were discussing, that whole entire, is that their point that they're broken enough that you can just kill them off? So, Tim, let's hypothetically say 100% certainly you know that that person is a person that will never be able to return to society and is 100% the person that's... I feel like it is killing in its infancy a very important element, which is that means that they are valuable as a scientific asset. And I'm not saying cut them up or whatnot, but as we've seen, a lot of psychological testing, a lot of criminological testing, a lot of just biological testing can be utilized from these people who quite literally cannot return to society. And that means we gain valuable resources. So the next time we run into something that's very similar, we can go, okay, cool. So what we've learned from the previous experience, and we have enough data points that we can move forward and go, okay, well, what works, what doesn't work, what is the reasoning behind this? And then, as Sam discussed, obviously not to kill 4-year-olds, but we can work out what was the point and then try and put stuff into place that will try and minimize the chances of those sorts of things occurring. Obviously, that's a very, restrictive point of view, but I personally feel like the removal of a human being from the societal thing is in a lot of ways a detriment to society as a whole. Regardless of whether they can live within or outside of society, it's valuable in developing, and I'll keep on coming back to it, it's valuable in developing the line of criminality so we can work out where is something beyond the scope of what should exist in society and what is considered the fringes of society. Does that cover basically enough, Tim?
Yes, no, it's good to get two sort of perspectives there, and from a outset from a utilitarian ethical sort of perspective of why death penalty probably isn't a solution in some ways. But what I was going to say, Sam actually brought up a really interesting point, which is sort of like the epistemological issue of the death penalty, which is the idea that you're never going to have enough certainty, like, some sort of weird, crazy version of phrenology / the Minority Report / Psychopaths, where you have an understanding of the point at which is that person now so much a threat to society that, boom, they now need to be removed. And Sam's favorite author, actually, Ayn Rand, sort of brought this up, and she always says that she didn't oppose the death penalty necessarily on the perspective that it was a just retribution. She opposed it on the epistemological sort of perspective that you could potentially be enabling state-sanctioned murder of a potentially innocent person. What I was going to ask you guys, though, is in some ways, as soon as you remove an individual from a societal sort of situation through imprisonment, do you think it's a just analogy for me to say that all imprisonment kind of has a similar effect in the sense that you were taking a non-refundable resource away from that individual? You were taking away time from their engagement in society, which is something they will never get back. So in some senses, all criminal findings and all criminal punishments are not something that can be undone once they've been put into place and executed. So in what way is the death penalty different to, for instance, a 25-year sentence with no parole for a violent murder? And Sam had his hand up first, so I'll go to Sam.
Yeah, and that's definitely an issue. I can't remember her name. Someone Chamberlain, maybe? The lady whose child was eaten by a dingo. She was made infamous as a child murderer. I think she spent 3 years in jail. That stuff she'll never get back because the legal system made a mistake. And I think ultimately we have to accept that there will be mistakes within the legal framework because it is being operated by fallible creatures. For instance, I was thinking of possibly talking about bail and whether or not bail is a good thing or a bad thing in our society, because I saw, what's his name? Haron Monis come up a little while back, and I was like, released on bail for a quite violent crime, or alleged violent crime, but proceeded to commit, as someone would possibly called it, upskilling, a more violent crime. So, yeah, any crime, any punishment cannot be taken back, even when it's wrongly punished. And I guess we just have to make a choice at which line we feel comfortable. Like, I don't think I would live comfortably in a society where as soon as you were charged with something, you were indefinitely detained until the legal system had done its thing. You know, because sometimes that's 2 to 3 years, and then to be found innocent, that's your life gone. But at the same time, we have people being released on bail who then proceed to commit heinous and violent crimes. So yeah, I think it's a very difficult balance assignment.
Wow. So I was originally going to answer Tim's one, but Sam's really threw me for a loop, because that's actually
My bad.
really, yeah, it's just this really interesting interplay. So yeah, obviously there's, it's an infallible force. It can only be controlled by infallible creatures. I personally, when it comes to the idea that, how much control can the justice system have, how much thing, you start getting scared because you realize that there are some little offshoots which, as you were discussing, like, you want to live in a world where you can't be detained for ongoing thing without some form of evidence, or at least some form of justice system. Yet exactly that is what Australia's specific terrorist laws are based around. Pretty much you can be held up for 48 hours and you can also be, charged for terrorism on the possession of things, because they don't know what is exactly specifically considered required to commit a terrorist act. So as long as they can deem it to be considered terrorist, you can be detained for 48 hours. Sam?
You could also be charged in silence, judged in silence, and convicted in silence, with no public records of the fact that you have been arrested, charged, convicted, tried, found guilty. So under our current system, they can do all of that in privacy. And whilst I understand the reasonings for it, I find it quite torn, because, we are meant to be in a open, transparent society with the costs that come with that. Yeah. Thoughts on that one, Tim? I know this is like massively derailing the conversation, but, it is crime and punishment ultimately.
No, actually, I thought that bringing it to the terrorism piece here is actually a really interesting sort of footnote and way to discuss and maybe close this out. So when we're talking about the Lint Cafe siege and that specific example you're talking about there, and it's not necessarily a great example in some regards when we start talking about the violence, but in terms of legal theory and in terms of public perception, most Western democracies are very happy for, if in the case of, for instance, the apprehension, prevention, or disruption of a terrorist event or a planned terrorist event, whether that be a white nationalist or whether that be an Islamist, who knows, if that individual was killed in that sort of process, that's a justified homicide in terms of society. So, and I mean, when you start talking about this at the military level, so we as a society are rather largely happy to accept that when we're dropping huge amounts of ordnance over somewhere like, say, for instance, Syria or Iraq, conducting strikes against Daesh, the height of the war, like, say, 2014, 2015, we understand that there's going to be individuals that are going to be killed who had either nothing or very little to do with it, or who maybe didn't necessarily, them being bombed didn't necessarily fit the crime. And I struggle to see, in terms of like how their lives matter that much differently from, for instance, an Australian's life. So an Australian who's committing a terrorist offence, if they were shot, like in that particular incident the individual was, they died. So I don't understand, so not necessarily arguing for the penalty in this sense, but if we're willing to accept death in those circumstances, why would we not necessarily be willing to accept it from a death penalty perspective? I'll throw it to you, Sam.
I think it shows how similar our thought patterns are. Is I was actually thinking about this much earlier on, and yeah, in my mind it popped to the Dresden bombings. So the UK and the US. Like these towers of liberal democracy, more than happy to firebomb and burn to the ground a city. The nuclear bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Like gargantuan civilian deaths. perfectly justifiable. And yet at the same time, like by the 1950s, I'm pretty sure by the 1940s, I'm pretty sure the UK had already outlawed the death penalty. And I think Australia had as well. So, like you said, we were perfectly fine to say, no, it's barbaric and inhumane to kill, a 10-time rapist murderer. But we're fine with bombing women and children because we don't have to look at them. So, yeah, it's a very big, I guess, cognitive dissonance that we seem to be really okay with. At least we're getting more precise with our munitions. So there is that. Simon?
I feel like at a point, humans stop being considered human and start becoming statistics. As there's always the discussion that, I think a lot of these discussions about humanity come to, it's the study that I don't actually even know if it's been followed up or whether I'm just, going off one particular study, but the ape study about the idea that humans can only really care about 100 people. And outside of that, it's just sort of a social facade or so on and so forth. And I feel like the issue is that once you have a face and a name, it's worth more emotional currency than the more distant. And also, when you are given a particular level of justification, they usually let stuff aside. This was really interesting. As with everything, I'm going to drag it into a side tangent, but they were talking about how I can't remember the exact thing, but it's the surplus army being given to policing in relation to America specifically, and how it changed their policing style simply because they felt like they were a military unit, inverted commas, and as such felt like they had the right to be more forceful in their actions of their enforcement. Tim?
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's actually a really good example in some ways, Simon, because you think about, in some ways it's a legal strategy and a PA strategy, but in terms of the people in Australia who became upset and were very vocal when it came to the trial of two drug smugglers in Indonesia, where drug smuggling carries a death penalty, you saw that there was a very marketed campaign in terms of trying to humanize them, show them how they'd changed, show that they're involved in watercolor painting and all this other stuff, and that really sold to a lot of people in Australia. Say what you want about Tony Abbott, in terms of the weird onion eater that he is, but he has a anti-death penalty, pro-life sort of perspective, and he burned a lot of political and diplomatic capital with the Indonesians trying to save two people, which, for a lot of Australians and also for some of our diplomatic community, maybe that wasn't necessarily the best use of our diplomatic capital. But what I will say, gentlemen, is that it has been a great discussion. It's great to be back, and really interesting opinions all around. So to our listeners, tune in next week, and we hope to hear from you.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.